Hi, everyone. I am Andrew Knapp. I am a senior acquisitions editor at Eerdmans, and today I have the privilege of talking with Bekah McNeel about her new book, Bringing Up Kids When Church Lets You Down, a guide to parents questioning their faith. Bekah is a journalist and mother of two who has written on a wide variety of topics, usually shorter form. This is her first novel. She often links contemporary issues with the evangelical church, and she's joining us today from her home in San Antonio, Texas. So welcome, Bekah.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
All right. So we're going to, at the end of this, Bekah is going to read a little section of her book, but we're going to start with a few questions. Some of us that readers have reached out to us at the press about, and so I get to kind of mediate those with Bekah. I'll just say I'm going to do my best not to jump in too much, but I will say at the outset that from the moment I first encountered the book proposal from Bekah, I was quite taken with it just because, well, we have very similar backgrounds. And I often say that when I read Rachel Held Evans' Evolving in Monkeytown, I felt like I was reading my autobiography written by someone else. And I feel like this book is maybe the next closest example that I've had to that sort of situation. And then when I started reading the various situations that Bekah was in as a child and then finds herself in as a parent, there was a lot of rhyme. But fortunately, she can write about it much more engagingly than I can and speak about it much more engagingly than I can as well. So I should let her do that now. So Bekah, the first thing that some people have asked us is, what was the first red flag, or maybe some of the first red flags that what you were taught in church growing up was not necessarily something that you wanted to pass on to your offspring?
Yes. Well, first, I do want to encourage you to jump in whenever, because so far what I've found is that the happiest thing about people reading this is when they text or reach out through my website and just say, me too, this is what happened. And for me, that's really confirming, because I didn't write a book that I was hoping people would be like, wow, that's exotic. Never thought that would be relevant. I want people to feel it and to see themselves in it and find the other people like them. And that's why there's discussion questions. And so, but the first red flags were that I was an anxious mess, and I was panicked about everything having to do with my children, and making sure I felt this huge responsibility to make sure that they ended up as good people, and that I could do something wrong and they were going to somehow end up in jail or something. And if I did everything right, then they were going to win the Nobel Prize in whatever field they chose. And that pressure, honestly, was the first big red flag to me that, I'm dealing with something I don't want them to deal with. Before that, I had some, deconstruction going on, questioning certain doctrines, questioning the social implications of faith, all of that, but I hadn't questioned too much about how it was affecting my relationships and how it was affecting, I didn't have kids to think about how it was affecting them. And I didn't make a connection as much between the residue of how I'd grown up,
Right,
and like the way it had kind of formed my soul or my personality, or the things that were lingering after the intellectual stuff and the social stuff had been more deconstructed, whatever.
So would it be fair to say that, that before children you had begun to sort of deconstruct aspects of your faith, but then it was really that having them and having certain questions be raised as to what you're going to do with them and how you want them to turn out, that then it took on a more tangible effect? Or?
Yeah, and I think it pushed me down into the roots. Okay, so it would be like saying before, I was saying, I don't believe that. I don't want to be associated with them. I want to be in the world this way, not that way. And then when I had kids, I went, oh, this is in me.
Mhm.
This has had implications for how I see the world and myself and others, and the role of mother and the role of family. And I am going to have to dig a little deeper to make sure that I don't set my kids up to have the same anxieties and fears that I have, because I'm realizing that they were tied to all those things I thought I left behind.
Yeah, and I think that's particularly interesting too, is I feel like just in recent years, there's been so much more that has come out about basically, I mean, trauma. I mean, largely from people's religious upbringing. I feel like I never really experienced that kind of aspect of it myself, but I've known so many people in similar situations who have that. Yeah, peace like a river does not necessarily attendeth every way. So yeah, I can
And I think,
definitely see why one doesn't want to pass that
yes,
along. And
yeah. And I mean, you don't want to pass down things you don't believe anymore.
right,
But I think that's the easier part. Like, yes, there's some technical, like, okay, so how do we explain a different idea of hell or whatever? But the bigger question is, why do I have so much shame?
yeah,
And why am I always scared that I'm not worthy of belonging in a family or something like that? Those questions are deeper. And it can be like, I'm still kind of exploring calling it religious trauma and whatnot, because I have certainly had relational harm
right,
done by people in the church that was given religious words. And so it ties to that. And then there's like long-term just malformation.
yeah,
Calling it trauma to me carries the connotation that, there was like abuse or conversion therapy or something like that happening, when really what it was is just kind of being brought up in a borderline insecure attachment. Even that's probably too clinical, but it's just this way of relating to authority that is anxious and fearful.
yeah, yeah. And okay, so uh, going on to the next one. So I think it would be fair to say, I mean, we were both definitely raised evangelical. Obviously, evangelical is a term that has lots of connotations now. I mean, we don't need to explore these labels, but what would you say church can look like for someone sort of walking the same journey as you? And what does church look like for you now?
Sure. Well, post pandemic, church doesn't look like anything. We were attending a little church and it didn't survive. It was,
Okay.
so for us, like day to day, we're not part of a congregation. We will never be members of a church again. We felt like it bound our conscience in a way that we weren't comfortable with. It was locking us into things absolutely that didn't need to be absolute and certain. But connecting to a body of believers is something I still really value and really want. And I want my kids to experience that, um, being in the presence of other people who are discussing spiritual things, corporate worship, communion. I love all of that connection and tangibility to God and love. We're going to be really careful with the local congregation we choose. And I think that people talk about finding it in a service organization, or, a kid's like other parents and a play group kind of thing, or a book club or something like
Right.
that. And I think that's all great and perfectly legitimate. Um, I do think there's something special about the purpose of the gathering
Right.
being spiritual, being to connect to God and others.
Right. And I think, yeah, especially, I mean, for those of us who I think grew up in this tradition and don't necessarily subscribe to all the particulars that we were raised with, but still, I mean, believe in God and can recite the creeds, in a true way, then yeah, church is something that is different than, as you're saying, than book clubs and just gathering for a group to do social justice. There's something different about deliberately connecting with God, as you're saying, and worshiping.
Yeah. Well, I think what's special about it is that the whole premise is that if all the other commonality fades away, we still have this.
Yeah.
And if it's based on something else, then it's secondary, and it's not communicating to you that this is the root of my acceptance and belonging.
Right. So what would you say to someone who is afraid to ask themselves some of the questions that you address in this book, especially because of their close-knit relationship with the church, and with often people have family relationships that are really tied up with this, and yeah, what would you say to these people who are nervous about exploring these things for what they might find?
Well, part of this comes from years as a journalist, and that is that you just kind of learn that if the truth isn't, if it's not based on the truth, whether that's the truth, whether it's your truth, your truth, the truth
Right.
about you, or facts, then it's really not sustainable, and it's not helpful because it's going to fall apart at some point anyway.
Right.
And so I think that there is you have to go into these questions knowing that the answers might fall along a spectrum of consequence.
Mm-hmm.
There could be things that as you explore and as you dig in, the Holy Spirit really convinces you that
Right.
this is critical, that this is non-negotiable for you, and it has great consequence. But be open to the fact that there's also things that are personal convictions and you don't need to break fellowship with everyone who raised you over them. And I think that's part of this whole change of paradigm that is so based in certainty and perfectionism and needing everything to be perfectly aligned and needing everyone to perform up to a certain standard to win my love.
Right.
I think just the process of questioning the beliefs that you grew up with, the beliefs of your community, actually really is a good discipline in doing that yourself, in holding tensions and letting things be true for me, but not for you, and differentiating between absolute moral truth and my personal convictions.
All right. So the next one is a three-parter, and it's deliberately a three-parter so that you can choose what you can go full politician and choose to ignore what would be more comfortable for you to ignore and respond to however you choose. But okay, so this book, I mean, it has a lot of episodes from your life growing up, and I mean, sort of one of the premises of this book is that there are aspects of your childhood and the tradition you were raised in that you really don't want to pass on. So for the first part is, how did your relationship with your own parents change as your spiritual and your ecclesial journey took you away from what you were raised with? Second, just how have your parents responded to this book? And third, how involved are they in your children's and their grandchildren's spiritual formation?
So thankfully, none of those questions I don't need to be super diplomatic about any of them, really, because they all have good answers. If you'd asked me this at any point in the past, I might have had a few more question marks of my own hovering above. But I would say that as my mind and then my heart and my life and my politics and everything as the ripples went through my life, my parents, I never questioned that they would still love me. By that point, my siblings had kind of tipped every sacred cow for me. And I was like, no, their threshold for pain is really high, actually. And so I'd never had that like, oh my gosh, this is it. I'm about to get kicked out of the family. Now, did I wonder if certain subjects would become taboo, or if they would either really want to talk to me about setting me straight or want to avoid certain topics altogether? Yes, I did feel like there was suddenly going to be some disappointment and some
Are
things
you
that were
talking about suddenly when the book came out, or
no,
when
no, just like
far earlier as
the
you're
first time I voted for a
deconstructing?
Democrat.
Okay.
I was like, oh my gosh, does this mean my parents aren't going to want to talk to me about politics anymore? Or when
I wish that were the case with me, but
yeah, no, actually, same. They wanted to talk about it more, um, and but have been on their own journey. And so at some point, I got the phone call of like, all right, talk to me about Joe Biden. I can't take Trump anymore. Talk to me. So we've come full circle, um, and not that I'm not,
yeah,
nobody has to be a Democrat or a Republican, but the same though when I kind of fully embraced being queer affirming in, like when I was putting stuff on social media, when I was hosting events that were kind of awareness events and stuff like that in my journalism work, I wondered when I wrote stories about abortion,
right.
And it wasn't from like a polemic standpoint.
Right.
I wondered, what's this going to be like? And so I had a lot of questions, and they actually weren't really answered for me until I wrote the book. And my mom she knows me, she knows my tone, which is can be hyperbolic or sardonic or
Right.
whatever. And so she was nervous about what I was going to say in the book. They have been on this journey of looking at the way they raised us and looking at how they've been hurt by the church, how they've been let down, and they've landed in a different place than I have. But we've all been on journey. So they weren't at all thinking, what could possibly be wrong with the way you were raised? Like, they knew there was stuff, but they were wondering how I was going to describe that,
Okay.
and how gentle or rough was I going to be, and which episodes was I going to tell. And so I gave them an early copy. Just, I wanted them to be ready. I didn't let them see the draft before I turned it in.
Okay.
I didn't want my need to please them. I knew there was nothing in there that was going to break the relationship. I knew there was nothing private, nothing, anything like that. But what I was afraid of was that if they frowned, I would be like, oh, never mind. And so I knew I needed to get past the point of no return, burn my ships, and then give it to them. And so once it was out, or once there was an early copy available, I gave it to them and didn't hear anything for like a month. I'm so scared. And then I went out there with my kid, out to see them with my kids, and they live about an hour away. And my mom, I was like, I'm not going to bring it up. I'm just going to let them decide what they want to talk about.
Okay.
And if you hear a noise, I'm sorry. It's my air conditioner. It's very loud. We're still in air conditioning mode down here.
Wow.
But about 5 minutes in, my mom said, well, I keep trying to read your book, but we've had house guests and they keep stealing it. But we're having great conversations, so I know it's good. And I was like, she said, I've gotten one chapter in, I love it. I laughed. So, she had all good things to say. And I started crying. I just said, Mom, I've been so worried. I'd been having nightmares about them, like kicking me out of the house and stuff, like crazy anxiety dreams. And she said, she goes, honey, this is your truth. You got to speak it. And I was like,
Wow.
who are you? Where's my mom? But that's her journey. She's been on that. Like, my mom was right there. She was on her journey. And I realized that was the love and acceptance she had been showing us in her way. But she too had been trapped by the way the church was saying, if you don't do this, they're going to run wild. So she had been kind of tortured by it too. So that's been great. As far as the role that they play in our kids' lives.
So first, let me interrupt and say, so Well, what are some of the stories that if you shared them would break your relationship with them? No,
I'm not going to
sorry.
Everything was going fine until this Facebook Live, and now I don't speak
The
to my
gotcha
family
question,
anymore.
but good to know that there is another trove. But
for the next book.
yes.
No, I don't think that there's any story I could tell. My parents have art, like they've got a strong stomach. I've done all sorts of public stuff and told family stories. I think it would be in the way I would tell it, like how fair and how it's hard not to go for the laugh sometimes for me. And I think that I could do that in a way that was harmful. So I think as long as I don't do that, they'll probably still let me come to dinner.
I do think it shines through in this book that, I mean, there are times when, I don't know if mocking is the right word, but I mean, it's definitely funny, and it's very funny. And they don't always come off in the greatest light, but it's clearly, I think, from a place of love, and that comes through. But anyway, sorry.
So, to that point, last night, there's an episode in the book that I'm going to withhold because I want people to buy it. But we had a launch event, and there was journalists and friends and everybody there, and there was a lot of people my parents didn't know, but they were there as well. And my dad kept introducing himself as the guy who burns the Smurfs. And to everyone's delight, it was very funny and very, I thought, like, they've fully embraced.
I hope you read that section. Then.
He did. He started doing it after I'd already read, and I was like, "Well, Dad, if I'd have known you were going to do that, I would have led with the Smurfs." Yeah.
Anyway, so I think I was interrupting you though.
Well, no, I was just going to go into the third question as far as my kids. The way I see the role of grandparents in, like, my children's grandparents in particular, my mother-in-law and my parents, is to expand my kids' field of love. That's a Lisa Miller's research that I cite in the book, and I have fully embraced, and that is that I trust them to communicate to my kids, "You're loved unconditionally," and they do it in the sweetest ways. The pressure is off. Moral formation's not on you. They know that. They like that. They're happy about that. All you have to do is make sure that this kid knows there's more people in their corner, right, and that they belong in this multi-generational network, or this family. And I will say that there's stuff later on as my kids are young. There's not a whole lot that they, most of the questions can be answered at this point. Later on, I think we will probably have to be more explicit about, hey, this is how we're going to handle this, and just ask for them to either share support. If they really want to give an alternate perspective, I don't mind. I'd love for my kids to hear it, but I want to know that they're doing it and be part of that conversation.
Right. Do you feel that there are any significant spiritual losses for your children with the way that you're raising them, compared with how you were raised? And I'll just say, this question, I'll admit, comes from me, and that's so. I'll share. I'll share that with. It's no accident that my dad, sort of his two kind of like obsessions in the church are with old earth creationism and with inerrancy of scripture. And my brother is now a biologist, and I went to grad school and studied Bible. And so these things clearly impacted us. And so as one who, spent all of my youth and much of my adulthood studying Bible, I realize now that with my kids, I haven't instilled it in them in the same way. And I read it to them, I teach them stories, but at the same time, they're not soaked in it in the way that I was growing up. And still today, I'll occasionally make references to fairly obscure things and realize that they'll be staring back at me blankly. And oh, that's kind of a bummer, that you don't have that. But
Yeah.
anyway, I'm just wondering if there's anything that kind of rhymes with you.
Yeah. I admit in the book that my daughter, this despite going to church and whatnot, had never heard the word Christian somehow when she was 7 years old. And we drove past we went to school in an auditorium, or we went to church in an auditorium, school auditorium. So we drove past a Greek Orthodox church, and she has questions, and she said, what is that? And we said, it's a church. What kind of church? We said, it's Christian. She said, what? Croissant? Like she said never heard the word.
Yeah.
And so what they're losing spiritually, I recognize that blank look that you're talking about with your kids.
Yeah. I mean, I get it in other areas as well. So
yeah, some of it I think is gaslighting. I know they do that. Like, I don't know what you're talking about, Mom. No, So one thing that I've thought about is that for those of us who are reaching the point that we're at now by taking a big monolith and breaking it up and deciding, like, I was handed this set of beliefs, this worldview, and it came with politics, and it came with family structure, and it came with all sorts of things. And I kind of was like carrying it around, and I had to break it up into pieces to be like, okay, valid, not valid, believe it, don't believe it, keeping, losing. It wasn't that cavalier, but I do think that starting from that monolith made my journey look a certain way. And probably one of my biggest places of discomfort is that I don't know what the journey looks like, taking little pieces and putting them together in your own way. I don't know what it looks like to construct a faith out of not handing someone a prepackaged, like being honest with them about, here are two different ways to look at it, because we're not going to present them just the way we believe. That's part of the deal, is that we're going to say some people believe this, we believe this, but others believe this, and they get to be part of this. I want it to be theirs, and I know that my opinion holds larger weight right now. I mean, that'll change developmentally when they're teenagers, but at the same time, I want them to have I want them to get to do the experience of building their faith. Now, the caveat is that that's terrifying because I don't know what they're building. And this could all go horribly wrong. But I think it's been the anxiety about that and the effort to prevent that and an opinion about what wrong looks like that made us go the other way and ended up with a lot of people with like attachment wounds and anxiety disorders. So I'm hoping to avoid that, and hopefully they don't avoid, morality in the process.
Yeah. So speaking of just being cavalier, my final question is, I mean, do you ever worry that with all these gray areas, you're essentially just damning your children to hell?
Clearly you've met them, because I worry about it all the time. So does the principal. No, I don't. Because hell was one of the first things to go. I believe in the Spirit. I believe my children have access to the Holy Spirit, and I believe that the Holy Spirit is going to do a much better job than I ever would of keeping my children connected to God and the way of God.
And so I guess we can just thank our parents that seeing their examples, we now have everything we need to do it perfectly. And other than that, we'll just pray that the universalists are correct.
So. I mean, I'm not personally concerned about hell at this point. I will say that. Now, that being said, do I want my children to, live the kind of life that I would in the past have said, oh yeah, they're going to hell? Or do I want them in whatever whatever version of justice looks like in the afterlife, do I want them to need some kind of justice rather than congratulations? No. But yeah, I think that my my security in grace and a more hopeful future for all mankind gives me a more hopeful future for my kids, and hopefully that makes their experience of being my children a happier one. And so there's a little less hell on earth.
Very well put. Well, with that, I will turn it over to the actual book, bringing up Kids When Church Lets You Down, and let you read a bit from the conclusion, I believe, that you are going to share with us.
Okay. And I have found, I did my first reading last night. I'm just going to give everyone out there a caveat that when I'm reading this, it feels like it's taking 100 years. So I selected a piece in confidence that it would be the right length. And if it feels like it's taking 100 years, I'm sorry. If it feels like I didn't give you enough, I hope that entices you to buy the book. So without further ado. Spirituality is innate to children, Lisa Miller writes, and parents, even parents who are doubting, play a primary role in cultivating it. Even if we have moved away from religion or grown uneasy with spiritual language, she encourages parents to facilitate their children's exploration. It's daunting for parents, especially those who are struggling, to feel like their child is going on a journey that is as uncertain and murky for them as it is for the parents. As adults, we've done school, we've done puberty, we've brushed our teeth thousands of times. All the challenges of survival we have, by virtue of being grown up, overcome. But when it comes to emotional and spiritual development, many of us are no further along than our children. As perfectionists, we often eschew what we cannot master, so that when we return to our discarded spirituality or emotional development, we make a disconcerting discovery. We are right where our kids are, waking up in a whole new world. That's where Miller's research is so reassuring. We might feel lost, but our children are not. They are fully seeing and discovering and will at times lead us. I think Jesus knew this too. When he said that those who enter the kingdom of heaven must be as little children, I think this is what he meant. That we must not be masters of our own universe, but explorers and learners awash in wonder. The road into the kingdom of God, shalom, peace on earth, is not an icy mountain road. It's a field of love. As soon as Moira could talk, I began to ask her, "Who loves you?" "Mommy, Daddy, God, Granny." She would go on to name her whole extended family, caregivers, and whichever friends she had most recently seen. This game continued as her memory improved and could go on for several minutes. One day, after a particularly joyful trip to the grocery store filled with chatty cashiers and helpful baggers, I asked Moira, "Who loves you?" "Oh, Mommy," she said, chuckling at my naivete. "Everybody in this city loves me." Moira's sprawling field of love stood in sharp contrast to my own view of the world, which had grown more hostile and combative in the years since I'd left my ministry job. Overwhelmed with cynicism, it would be years before I assessed my own field of love and found it largely defensive and transactional, lacking in the real conversations and vulnerability needed to sustain connection. As a journalist, it is easy to end up in this situation. We swim in a world of bad news and deep conversations solely for the purpose of work. It's easy and yet dangerous because the more I saw the world as hostile, the more I felt like I had to be perfect to get anything good. I believed if I stopped performing, no one would help me. Worse, if I let the wrong person get too close, they would take advantage of me. People became liabilities, threats to my time and peace of mind. God seemed hostile too, or at least distant. shrouded in the fog of past hurts and twisted theologies. I was trying to hold up my end of all the bargains. Atonement's promise that when God looks at you, God sees Jesus should have comforted me, I told myself. So why couldn't I get past the hurt that God would never be able to stand the sight of me as me? I was grateful, but sad. God and I were not close. We had reached détente, but not allyship. That was the most I felt I could expect, despite ample evidence of abundance in my life. Healthy kids, loving marriage, professional success, helpful extended family, great grocery stores. Through prayer and therapy, I ultimately found my way back. Following Moira was part of it. We grew together in our ability to name and express emotions. We explored God and social justice together. Her baptism and love of church gave me a reason to stay connected. One day, during a meditative prayer, I asked myself, why am I still doing this? With all the crap that came along with religion, how am I still praying? Immediately, pictures of my own baptism came to mind. I could hear things my parents had said about God's love. I remembered the talk my dad had with me before my first communion. I could feel the passion of my early teenage recommitment to following Jesus. I remembered hearing God's voice clearly as I moved to a new city, became desperately lonely, found a church, and took communion. My parents had given me access to words and rituals that would connect me to God in ways that they could not have predicted, ways beyond their control or the control of the pastors and priests who would follow. I came back to the church not out of fear, but because it was where God had been meeting me for 30 years, sometimes through the words and teachings and songs, sometimes in spite of them. I also expanded my spirituality. I left behind the church's obsession with certainty and fought tooth and nail to rid toxic certainty and perfectionism from my work, relationships, and parenting. Sometimes the best I could do was apathy. Sometimes it was defiance. There were moments of genuine openness. In the middle of this journey, we had another child. On November 5th, 2017, our son Asa was baptized. This time under a tent in a special All Saints' Day service with 2 Anglican churches combined. Less of a ham than his sister, Asa endured the anointing and christening with a stoic face, only slightly more animated when the priest walked him down the center aisle, showing the congregation its newest family member. Meanwhile, 33 miles away in Sutherland Springs, minutes before the water touched my son's head, a gunman burst into another church. He killed 25 people, including grandparents, little children, and a pregnant woman. Looking back at my blog post from the following day, I can now see that I was struggling to make sense of several things. One, the maddening juxtaposition of the 2 church services, ours so happy and theirs unspeakably tragic. 2, the role of Christians in the gun culture that made it so easy for an unstable person to get hold of an assault rifle, and 3, my own decision to bring children into a violent world and expose them to a community complicit in that violence. I wrote, I can imagine God in my chaos, but what about that chaos? What about the chaos of violence and tragedy? Does grace go there? Does our baptism mean anything in that context? My conclusion that day and now is yes. In the post, I reflect on the child being baptized, Asa. His name means healer. To raise him into that promise, he does need a connection to a wellspring of spiritual health. He also needs freedom from the rigid certainty and control of what American religion has become. His baptism and his sisters, their fathers and my own, are not about particular churches or particular creeds. Our baptism is about acceptance and identification as the children of God, not in a way that makes us more malleable and dependable voters and tithers, but in a way that makes us deeply secure, confident, and generous.
Thank you very much for that, Bekah. Also, before I sign off, I want to share the very positive news that very recently Bekah and we at Eerdmans reached an agreement to publish a second book, and which Bekah is now writing, and just informed me right beforehand that I just finished the third chapter of. Would you like to just share in a sentence or two what the next one will be about?
Sure. So this next one it's pulled from observations from years of reporting, and I had been observing how our view of suffering informs our stance on social issues. In particular, how we decide whether suffering is tolerable or intolerable, and how that determines where we stand on issues like abortion, immigration, COVID protocols, gun rights, etc. And so I had this really complicated calculus coming in, and Andrew actually in an early conversation said, but isn't it just that my suffering is always intolerable and yours is always tolerable? I was like, that's a pamphlet, not a book. So I had to complicate the idea of you and me and us and them. And so that's kind of what I've been working on right now, is looking at how we tell stories, the story that we're telling about suffering. When we look at the abortion debate, what stories are we telling about who should suffer and who should not suffer? And how does that ultimately land us on a position?
Thanks. And yeah, I look forward to that a lot. It's a wonderful idea for a book. And I know that you're going to be kind of reflecting through these things on Jesus' command to take up the cross and follow him. And yeah, it's just, I think it'll be a lovely book.
Yes, there's Jesus in there too, of course.
Yeah. So thank you again so much for being with us today, Bekah. I encourage anyone who has not yet gotten a copy of Bringing Up Kids When Church Lets You Down to do so. It's available for order at the normal venues. And again, anyone who grew up in American evangelicalism, I think in the late 20th century, will identify with quite a lot and laugh and groan along the way and gain a lot of insight. So thank you so much. We look forward to reading this, seeing the next one, and much more in the future.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.